In the year 1734, the pirate brig Black Heron was sailing from the shores of Jamaica to the secret harbors of Hispaniola when an October hurricane threw it onto the reefs of an unnamed island in the Jardines de la Reina archipelago. They made their way ashore with their loot and their hopes, but found a beach littered with bones split lengthwise and a silence in which no bird sang. What emerged from the jungle on the third night left no witnesses capable of describing them in full. Only scars on the body of the last survivor, an imprint of a jaw with extra teeth that a human should not have. So, before we continue, please make sure you're subscribed and let us know where you're watching from. Thank you. I was 31 years old when the waves washed me up on the sand of that cursed island. I was a carpenter on an English merchant ship before debt drove me to the pirates, and my hands knew wood better than anything else in the world. Those hands would later build the raft that saved my life. But at that moment, they were just shaking from the cold and fear as I coughed up seawater and tried to figure out if I was even alive. Captain Hernando Salgado, whom everyone called Raven because of his black hair and hoarse voice, was the first to reach the shore. 30 years at sea had carved him into a creature that seemed to be made of tarred ropes and iron, and smallpox had disfigured his face so badly that children cried at the mere sight of him. He stood knee-deep in the surf, counting us as we climbed out of the water, his one good eye. He had lost the other in a fight on Tortuga, burning with the grim fire of a man accustomed to loss. Quartermaster Josiah Flint crawled ashore after me, coughing and cursing in his Scottish dialect so that I could barely understand half the words. He was over 50, one eye covered by a black patch, but the other saw sharper than any ship's boy. He had sailed these waters for 20 years and knew every reef, every shoal, every island, or so he thought. He didn't recognize this island, and that was the first thing that alarmed me. Mary O'Brien climbed out of the waves, clinging to a piece of the mast, and collapsed on the sand next to me. An Irish woman with rust-colored hair, she had come aboard the Heron 3 years ago, disguised as a cabin boy, and stayed on when the captain discovered the deception. She became a gunner, the best on the ship, and I saw her hands load a cannon faster than any man on board. Now those hands were shaking, but the look in her green eyes remained steady. Cesar was the last to climb out, a silent Cuban mulatto, the best navigator I had ever met. He hardly ever spoke, but when he did, his words were worth a dozen of anyone else's. Miraculously, his machete was still on his belt, and the first thing he did was check to see if the steel had rusted from the seawater. The other 23 men remained at sea. The cook, the boatswain, the Marines, the ship's boys. They all belonged to Davy Jones now, and we could only hope that he would receive them with dignity. We spent the first few hours in a daze, gathering the wreckage of the tzapla that the surf had washed ashore. 3 barrels of fresh water, one of them punctured. A box of biscuits, soggy but edible. Several coils of rope, sailcloth, flintlock pistols, 6 of them, 3 of which could still fire after drying. The quartermaster's musket, which he clutched to his chest like a child. Gunpowder in oiled bags. It was a miracle that it had remained dry. An axe, Cesar's machete, knives, and the captain's map in oiled cloth. The very one with red ink and a century-old warning. Salgado spread it out on the sand, smoothed it with his wrinkled fingers, and stared at it for a long time, comparing the outline of the coast with the lines on the paper. "This is it," he said finally, his voice hoarse from the salt. "The island of the devourers. Los comedores." Josiah spat on the sand. He knew these maps as well as the captain, if not better. The Spaniards named it that for a reason. There was a fort here, San Antonio. The garrison disappeared without a trace 100 years ago. Ships don't come here. Ships don't come here because of the reefs, Salgado snapped. We ran into them ourselves. There's no need to be afraid. I said nothing then, but something about this island had felt wrong from the start. Something I sensed before I realized it. Silence. In the Caribbean, the islands scream. Seagulls, pelicans, parrots, monkeys in the jungle. There is always sound. There is always life. Here there was nothing. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, no lizards rustling in the undergrowth. Only the waves rolled onto the sand with a lazy indifference, and there was no wind. After the hurricane, the sea lay still as glass, and the air was so heavy with moisture that every breath was difficult. "There are no birds here," Mary said, her voice sounding too loud in the dead silence. "The hurricane scared them away," the captain muttered. but I saw his hand involuntarily drop to the pistol on his belt. We set up camp on the beach, away from the surf line, under the skeletons of palm trees that the hurricane had stripped to bare trunks. Cesar and Josiah went along the shore to look for fresh water and assess the size of the island. Mary cleaned her weapon, laying out the parts on a piece of sailcloth with a methodicalness that betrayed years of practice. The captain sat over the map, muttering something under his breath. I started gathering wood for a fire, and that's when I saw the bones. At first, I mistook them for driftwood, whitish debris scattered among the remains of some old shipwreck. But then I leaned closer, and my hand froze halfway to what I thought was a branch. It was a thigh bone, human, split lengthwise, revealing the cavity where the brain had once been. I looked around and then saw them everywhere. Bones were everywhere. On the beach, among the debris, half buried in the sand. Ribs, vertebrae, skulls with knocked-out teeth. Dozens, maybe hundreds of people had met their end on this shore, and their remains had been lying here so long that the sun and salt had bleached them to the color of old ivory. And all the long bones were broken. Every single one. "Captain?" I called, and my voice sounded strange. Salgado came over, looked at the bones, and for the first time, I saw something like uncertainty on his disfigured face. It lasted only a moment, then his features hardened again. "Shipwrecks. There are reefs here, I saw them myself. The poor guys crashed, and the sharks gnawed on them. Sharks don't split bones lengthwise, Captain. Sharks don't get to the brain." He gave me the kind of look that made the ship's boys wet their pants. But I wasn't a boy anymore, and I'd seen too much. "You're a carpenter, Crane. Stick to wood. Bones aren't your business." But I saw him step back from the spot as if the sand beneath the bones might burn him. Cesar and Josiah returned at sunset. They had found a stream of fresh water a quarter of an hour's walk into the island, but they looked as if they had seen something there they didn't want to talk about. Josiah immediately demanded whiskey. We had one flask left, miraculously spared, and drank half of it in one gulp. "There are tracks," said Cesar, and those were the first words I heard from him all day. "By the stream, lots of tracks." "What tracks?" asked the captain. Cesar didn't answer. He just crouched down and drew an outline in the sand. Elongated with long toes like a human footprint, but distorted, irregular. "Big," he added after a pause, "very big, and only in one direction." "Which way?" "From the sea inland. There are no return tracks." We fell silent, digesting this. Traces that only lead deeper into the island. Never back. As if those who left them never returned to the water. Or as if they came from the sea and stayed here forever. Before we continue, write in the comments. Have you ever found tracks that you couldn't explain? Your opinion is important to us. That first night we built a fire, a big, bright one, made of dry palm trunks and debris from the Heron. The fire crackled and spat sparks into the black sky, which was completely devoid of stars. The clouds left behind by the hurricane covered the entire sky with an impenetrable veil. We sat around the fire, eating soggy crackers and remaining silent, each lost in our own thoughts. Mary checked the pistols one by one, clicking the triggers and checking the flints. Josiah drank slowly and methodically, as if he wanted to drown what he had seen by the stream in whiskey. Cesar sat with his back to the fire, facing the jungle, his eyes fixed on the black wall of trees. The captain was drawing something in the sand, a plan for how to get off the island. We needed to build a raft, wait for the wind, and try to reach Trinidad. 2 days at sea, maybe 3 if the wind was weak. But there was no wind. The sea was dead calm, and sails would be useless. I stared at the fire and thought about the bones on the beach, about the footprints leading in only one direction, about the inscription on the map. 43 souls. And what had happened to the garrison of the Spanish fort 100 years ago. And then Caesar said a word that made us all turn around. "There," he said, pointing into the jungle. I looked where he was pointing and at first saw nothing but darkness between the trees. But then, just for a moment, something flashed, like the reflection of light in a cat's eyes, only higher. Much higher, at the level of a human face. If that person were a head taller than the tallest of us, then another flash, and another, and another. "How many are there?" Mary whispered, her hand already gripping the pistol. I didn't know. I didn't want to know, but there were many flashes. Maybe 5, maybe 10, scattered among the trees at the edge of the light from our campfire. They didn't move. They just watched. "Animals," said the captain, but his voice sounded uncertain. "Some kind of wild pigs, or cats. "Wild pigs don't stand on two legs," Josiah replied, and his hand reached for his musket. The reflections disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. They simply dissolved into the darkness, as if those who had been watching us had retreated deep into the jungle. We sat awake until dawn, clutching our weapons and listening to the silence, which was so thick it rang in our ears. None of us slept a wink that night. With the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds, we finally allowed ourselves to relax. The day seemed safe. The heat, humidity, and still air weighed heavily on our shoulders, but fear receded, giving way to fatigue and practical concerns. We needed water, we needed food, we needed a plan. The captain divided us into groups. Cesar and I were to go to the stream for water. Mary and Josiah were to search the shore for any surviving supplies from the Heron. The captain himself stayed at camp to draw up a plan for the raft and guard what little we had. Cesar and I headed deeper into the island, following the trail that he and Josiah had blazed the day before. The jungle closed in above us, stifling, dark, smelling of rot and dampness. Vines hung from the branches like dead snakes, and black mud sloshed underfoot, left over from the rains that had accompanied the hurricane. And again, silence. No birds, no insects, no rustling of lizards in the undergrowth. Only our footsteps and heavy breathing. We found the stream quickly. A thin trickle of water seeping from a crevice in the rock and collecting in a small pool surrounded by stones. The water was clear and cold, and I eagerly pressed my lips to it, washing away the salt that seemed to have soaked through me. Cesar did not drink. He knelt at the edge of the pool and stared at the ground. "Come here," he said quietly. I approached and saw the footprints. They were everywhere. On the soft earth by the water, on the wet sand, between the rocks. Human feet, but misshapen, irregular. The toes were too long, as if each phalanx were a third longer than it should be. And the size. Cesar placed his palm next to one of the footprints. His palm was broad, like everyone who works hard with their hands, but it didn't cover even 2/3 of the print. The footprint was huge, a third larger than the foot of the tallest man I had ever seen. "My God," I whispered, my heart pounding in my throat. I crouched down, trying to comprehend what my eyes were seeing. The footprints were deep. Whoever left them was heavy. The edges were clear, not crumbling. The tracks were fresh, perhaps from the night before, and they went in only one direction. From the stream deeper into the island, up the hillside, to where the trees grew even thicker. Not a single footprint led back to the water. I tried to imagine the creature that could have left such prints. A person with feet 1.5 times larger than mine, with toes as long as a monkey's. A person who came to the water at night and left for the interior of the island at dawn. Or not a human at all. "We need to go back," I said, my voice trembling. Cesar nodded, but before leaving, he did something strange. He leaned over one of the footprints, sniffed it, and his face contorted with disgust. "They stink," he said. "Even the footprints stink." I didn't ask what exactly. I could already smell it myself. Faint, almost imperceptible. But it made my throat tighten with nausea. Rotting meat left out in the sun, and something else beneath the rot. Cloyingly sweet, sticky, the kind of thing that stays in your mouth even after you stop breathing through your nose. We filled the barrel with water and almost ran back to camp. The captain listened to our story in silence. His jaw clenched so tightly that his jaw muscles bulged beneath his scarred skin. Josiah and Mary returned a little later. They had found a few more useful items among the wreckage, including a coil of rope and an almost intact sail. But the news they brought was worse than ours. "There's a fort," Josiah said, his voice hoarse. "Spanish. About 2 miles along the shore. San Antonio, I think." "So what?" asked the captain. Josiah didn't answer right away. He took out a flask with the remains of whiskey, drank it in one gulp, and threw the empty vessel onto the sand. "There's no one there. The walls are half ruined. Everything's overgrown with vines. But inside," he paused, searching for the right words. "There are weapons. Muskets, sabers, even a small cannon. Everything's rusty, 100 years old. But not a single body, Captain. Not a single bone. So what? The thing is, there are scratches on the stones. Deep like claw marks, or fingernail marks, as if people were being dragged out and they were clinging to everything they could reach. The silence that followed these words was thick and heavy, like the air before a storm. 43 souls, Mary said quietly. And I realized that she had also read the inscription on the map. An entire garrison. Where did they go? No one answered, but we were all thinking the same thing. The bones on the beach. The broken bones from which someone had removed the brains. In the afternoon, we found the totems. Cesar discovered them when he went to gather wood for the fire. He returned pale, despite his dark skin, and silently led us to the edge of the jungle, where the trees were particularly dense. Poles rose between the palm trunks, roughly carved from solid tree trunks, decorated with something that made me recoil. Skulls. Human skulls tied together with vines and grass, strung on sticks attached to the pillars. Dozens of skulls. Old ones, darkened by time, and new ones, still covered with bits of flesh and hair. Between the skulls were bones, ribs, vertebrae, fingers, woven into eerie patterns that made no sense to my mind, but somehow evoked a primal, animalistic horror. Holy Virgin, Mary whispered and crossed herself. I didn't know she was Catholic. However, on this island, probably every one of us remembered God. This is the border, Josiah said, his voice strangely calm. They're marking their territory, like wolves. Who are they? Asked the captain. But the question was rhetorical. We all already understood that we were not alone on this island. We returned to camp in silence, and for the rest of the day, no one strayed more than 10 steps from the fire. The captain worked feverishly on a plan for a raft, and I joined him. My craft could finally be of use. We found enough planks and logs to build something that could float, but without a sail or oars, it was useless. The sea lay still, and not a leaf stirred on the trees. We were trapped. As the sun set, the fear returned, stronger than the day before. We now knew what awaited us here. We had seen the tracks, the totems, the fort with scratches on the stones. We knew that somewhere deep within this island lived something that had destroyed the Spanish garrison 100 years ago and had since fed on those whom the sea had washed ashore. The fire crackled, scattering sparks. We sat around it, gripping our weapons, listening to the darkness. Maybe there aren't that many, Mary said, her voice sounding almost convincing. Maybe we can shoot them all. There were a lot of tracks, Cesar replied. A lot. We don't know what they are, said the captain. Maybe just some savages. Cannibals. We've dealt with those before. The Spanish garrison couldn't handle them, Josiah reminded him. 43 men with muskets and cannons. The captain opened his mouth to argue, but at that moment a sound came from the jungle that made us all fall silent. It sounded like singing or mumbling, guttural, gurgling, as if whoever was making these sounds was doing so with a throat that was not human. Clicking, wheezing, gurgling. It wasn't words in any language I knew, but it was speech. It was definitely speech, and the sound came from all directions at once. Mary raised her gun, but the captain grabbed her arm. Don't shoot. Don't show that you're afraid. I don't know how he could speak so calmly when my own hands were shaking so much that I could barely hold the axe. The murmuring continued, for a minute, 2, 3, surrounding our camp with an invisible ring. They were everywhere. They were talking. They were discussing us. Then the sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was even worse. It pressed on my ears, penetrated my skin, got into my head. I felt sweat running down my back, cold despite the stuffiness. My muscles were tense. They didn't attack that night, but we knew now that they were there, and we knew they were waiting. When dawn finally painted the sky gray, I discovered that I had spent the entire night gripping my axe so tightly that my fingers were numb. We all looked terrible, haggard, red-eyed, hands trembling, but we were alive. We need to find their lair, said the captain, and his words sounded like a sentence. Why? Mary asked. Why look for them when they'll find us themselves? Because I want to know what we're dealing with, how many there are, where they hide during the day. If we find their lair, maybe we can do something. No one asked what exactly we could do. No one believed we could do anything against what lived on this island. But sitting and waiting for them to come for us was even worse. Josiah volunteered to go scouting. He knew the jungle better than we did, and his one eye could see things in the undergrowth that the rest of us couldn't. The captain wanted to go with him, but Flint shook his head. One man is faster and quieter. I'll be back before noon. He left and we waited. Noon passed. The sun began to sink toward the west. Josiah did not return. The captain glanced at the jungle more and more often, and even his iron composure began to crack. Mary cleaned the pistols over and over again, even though they were already as clean as they could be. Cesar sat motionless, staring at a single point, his lips moving silently. He was praying in his own language, which I did not understand. I worked on the raft because it was the only thing I could do. My hands knew wood, and as long as I was planing, sawing, and tying, I could avoid thinking about what awaited us at night. Josiah appeared at sunset, stumbling out of the jungle, pale as death. His clothes were torn, and he held his musket as if he had forgotten what it was. "Caves," he gasped, collapsing on the sand next to the fire, at the other end of the island, in the rocks. "Did you see them?" asked the captain. Josiah didn't answer. He stared into space, his one eye huge, almost insane. "Flint?" The quartermaster flinched, as if waking from a dream. "I saw the drawings on the walls of the cave at the entrance. Tall figures eating little people. And inside, he fell silent, shuddering. The smell was so bad that I didn't go inside. I couldn't." "What kind of smell?" Josiah looked at the captain, and there was something in his gaze that I had never seen before. Not in the most violent boarding operations, not in the most terrible storms. Death and something else, something sweet beneath the death. It makes you want to throw up everything you've ever eaten in your life. We exchanged glances. We all smelled it, there by the stream, faint, barely perceptible. Now we knew where it was coming from. Night crept up unnoticed, and with it, fear returned. We doubled the fire, throwing everything that could burn into it, and the flames rose to human height, illuminating the sand 20 paces around. The muttering began earlier than the day before. It was not yet completely dark when we heard those clicking, gurgling sounds. From all sides, closer than yesterday. They surrounded us in a circle, and the circle was closing in. "Weapons at the ready," whispered the captain. 5 pistols, a musket, an axe, a machete. Against whatever was hiding in the jungle, it seemed laughably small. I saw the first of them when the muttering subsided. He stood at the edge of the light, where the flames of the fire could no longer dispel the darkness. A tall figure. A head and a half taller than the captain, who was himself a tall man. Stooped, with hands that hung below his knees and fingers long and crooked like the branches of a dead tree. I couldn't see his face clearly, only the glint of his eyes, yellow like a cat's, deep set in their sockets, and his jaw, huge, protruding forward like a bulldog's, only more frightening. Others appeared beside him. 5, 6, more. They stood at the edge of the light and stared at us without making a sound. Their jaws moved slowly, rhythmically, and I heard a soft clicking sound, like a dog chewing on a bone. "Mother of God," Mary breathed, her voice trembling. The creatures didn't move. They didn't attack, growl, or threaten. They just stood and watched us, with a patience I had never seen in animals. It was the patience of a hunter who knows his prey isn't going anywhere. One of them took a step forward, and the light from the fire fell on its body. Its skin was pale, almost gray, covered with sores and strange growths. Its body was naked, but there was nothing human about this nakedness. It was the body of a creature that had once been human but had ceased to be so many generations ago. It opened its mouth and made that same guttural sound. Gurgling, clicking, something like words, but words in a language that should not exist. The captain fired. The roar of the pistol split the silence, and I saw the creature recoil. The bullet hit it in the shoulder. I saw the flesh split open, dark, almost black blood spurting out. The creature fell, and then the others moved, but not as I expected. They didn't rush forward, they didn't attack. 2 of them picked up the fallen body and dragged it back into the darkness, while the rest retreated, disappearing among the trees as silently as if they weren't there. We stood, gripping our weapons, waiting for the attack, but it did not come. Only the muttering, quiet, distant, continued throughout the night, surrounding our camp with an invisible ring. At dawn, I realized that my legs would not hold me. 2 days without sleep, constant fear, tension. All of this drained my strength faster than any work could. We were all on the verge, haggard, trembling, with madness in our eyes. "They didn't attack," Mary said, her voice sounding more surprised than relieved. "Why? Because they're not stupid," replied the captain, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "They saw that we had weapons. They saw that we could hurt them. They don't want to take any chances. They're waiting," Josiah added, "waiting for us to weaken." I looked at the sea. It was still as a mirror. No breeze. No hope of rescue. "The raft," I said. "I need another day. Maybe 2. If we have oars, we can row." The captain nodded. "Get to work." The rest of you, don't stray from the camp. If anyone needs to go into the bushes, go in pairs. Keep your weapons ready. Don't sleep alone. I spent the next few hours working on the raft like a man possessed. My hands did what they knew how to do, tying logs, fastening boards, checking joints, while my mind was somewhere far away, where there was no island, no creatures, no fear. By noon, the raft was almost ready. Rough and clumsy, but capable of carrying 5 people and a few supplies. All that remained was to make oars and wait for the tide. Cesar helped me, and even his usual silence seemed comforting now. He worked quickly without unnecessary words, and his dark hands did the same work as mine. Tying, fastening, building. "They're not animals," he said suddenly, and I jumped. It was the first thing he had said in several hours. What? These creatures. They're not animals. They think, they plan, they wait. I didn't know what to say. He was right, and that was the worst part. An animal can be scared away, driven off, killed, but a creature that thinks, that plans. "How many are there?" I asked. Cesar shrugged. "A lot. Dozens. Maybe more." "How do you know?" He looked at the jungle and his eyes narrowed. "The tracks, I counted them. Different sizes, big, medium, small. There's a whole tribe out there, Crane. A whole damn tribe. Tribe." The word stuck in my head like a splinter. Not a pack, not a group, a tribe. Creatures with a language, customs, and totems at the edge of the jungle. Creatures that were once human but had become something else. And we were on their territory. Night fell, as it always does in the Caribbean. Swiftly, without warning. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness descended on the island like a black blanket. We built another fire and gathered around it again, gripping our weapons. The murmuring began earlier than usual. The sky still held the last glimmers of sunset when the sounds came from the jungle. Clicks, gurgles, wheezes, and they were closer, much closer. "They're coming," Josiah said, his voice strangely calm. I didn't have time to answer. The darkness exploded with movement. They weren't sneaking up, creeping cautiously. They rushed forward, tall, hunched figures, pale in the light of the fire with open mouths and outstretched arms. There were many of them, 10, 20, more, and they attacked from all sides at once. The crack of a gunshot. The captain fired his pistol at the nearest creature, and it fell, but 2 others took its place. Mary fired, reloaded, fired again. Her hands worked with incredible speed, and every bullet found its target. I rushed forward with my axe because I had no weapon. The blade cut into someone's hand. Long, pale, with crooked fingers. And I felt the bone crunch under the steel. The creature howled, a high, piercing scream, and retreated. But there were too many of them. "To the beach!" shouted the captain. "To the raft!" We ran. It wasn't a retreat. It was a flight. We ran across the sand toward the water, toward the raft I had spent 2 days building, and the creatures pursued us, their guttural cries mingling with our heavy breathing. I turned around only once, and that moment remains in my memory forever. Mary fell. One of the creatures, a huge one, with arms that seemed endless, knocked her down onto the sand and dragged her back toward the jungle. She was still shooting. I heard the shots, 1, 2, and screaming. She was screaming my name. I wanted to go back. God knows I wanted to go back. But the captain's hand grabbed my collar and dragged me forward. "No! Run!" Josiah stumbled. I saw him fall, saw the creatures cover him with their pale bodies. I heard him curse us, me, the captain, the whole world. Then his voice trailed off. Cesar disappeared. I didn't see it happen. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. Maybe they grabbed him in the commotion. Maybe he broke away from the group and ran the other way. I don't know. The captain and I ran to the water. The raft was there, rough, unfinished, without oars, but it was floating, tied to a stake driven into the sand. "Push!" shouted the captain. I grabbed the rope, pulled, and the raft slid across the wet sand toward the surf. The waves, the first waves in days, licked my boots. The tide. The tide was coming in. The captain turned to shoot the nearest creature, and at that moment, someone, lunged out of the thicket and grabbed him by the legs. I saw his face for the last time, disfigured by smallpox, distorted by rage and fear. He managed to say only one word, "Run," and then he was gone. I pushed the raft away from the shore and jumped on it, feeling neither the cold water nor the pain in my scraped hands. The tide caught me. Weak, but enough to carry the raft several dozen steps away from the shore. I rowed with my hands. I rowed with all my strength until my muscles began to burn, and my lungs felt like they were bursting from lack of air. The shoreline slowly receded, and with it, the pale figures that had gathered at the water's edge and were watching me. They didn't go into the water. They stood on the shore and watched, and muttered. I could hear their muttering even when the shore became a dark strip on the horizon. I woke up in pain. The sun was high, and its rays burned my skin as if I were lying on a hot frying pan. My lips were cracked. My tongue was swollen, and every breath of air was like a mouthful of sand. The raft rocked on the waves, light, lazy waves that carried me to who knows where. I tried to sit up and screamed. My left leg was covered in blood. There was a deep, inflamed, ragged wound on my calf, and when I looked closely, I saw teeth marks on the edges of the wound. Human teeth, but no, not quite human. Too many, too sharp. I remembered, vaguely, as if in a dream, the moment when one of the creatures clamped onto my leg. I broke free, leaving a chunk of flesh behind, and didn't even feel any pain at that moment. Now I felt it. I drifted in the open sea for 3 days, without water, without food, without hope. Fever came in waves, sometimes heat, which made me toss and turn on the raft, sometimes cold, which made my teeth chatter. The wound on my leg became infected and emitted a smell. The same sweetish, rotten smell that I'd first noticed by the stream on the island. On the 3rd day, I saw a sail. A Spanish merchant ship picked me up in the evening. I don't remember how they pulled me on board. I don't remember the first days of fever when the ship's doctor cleaned my wound and shook his head, muttering something about gangrene and amputation. I came to in Havana in prison. The Spanish don't like pirates. I was supposed to be hanged. It's standard procedure, quick and effective. But something made the governor change his mind. Maybe it was my story. I told it over and over again in my delirium while I was still feverish. Maybe it was my leg. The ship's doctor showed the governor the bite mark, the traces of jaws imprinted on my flesh. A human bite, but not quite. Too big, and 2 more teeth than a human should have. The governor looked at my leg for a long time. Then he ordered me to be released and put on the first ship to the British colonies. Tell your people, he said to me at last. Tell them not to sail there. I told them. I told them for years. In port taverns, in brothels, on ships that took me in out of pity. No one believed me. The pirates laughed, saying, Crane ate too much rotten salted meat. The Spanish authorities dismissed it all as pirate tales. The island was marked on maps as dangerous because of the reefs. Nothing more. A year after my rescue, a Spanish patrol ship disappeared in that area with its entire crew. 30 men. No one connected this with my story. 2 years later, a Portuguese merchant ship disappeared. Then a French schooner. Ships vanished, and no one wondered why. 12 years have passed. I live in Boston. I have a wife, a kind woman who doesn't ask why I scream at night. A son, a 6-year-old boy who will never know that his father was a pirate. A carpentry workshop, small but enough to feed my family. I no longer go to sea. I don't even go to the harbor unless I absolutely have to. At night, when the wind comes from the east, I dream of their singing. It's a clicking, gurgling sound, a language that shouldn't exist. I wake up in a cold sweat and lie in the dark for a long time, listening to the silence before I can close my eyes again. The scar on my leg never healed completely. The skin tightened and turned white, but the shape of the jaw, the imprint of teeth, remained forever. It itches before rain. It itches more intensely before every October, before hurricane season. During those days, I hardly sleep. Sometimes, when people trust me enough, and there are very few such people, I show them this scar, and they fall silent, because it's impossible not to see it. A human bite, but too big, and 2 extra teeth, distinct, irrefutable. This is proof, the only proof that I'm not lying. I know what I saw on that island. I know that these creatures are the descendants of people disfigured by centuries of isolation and cannibalism. I know that they are still there in their caves, waiting for the next ship to crash on the reefs. And I know they remember my taste. Sometimes I wonder, how many ships have crashed on those reefs since the Black Heron? How many poor souls made it to that shore thinking they were saved? They weren't saved. No one is saved from there, only me. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the wind howls outside the window and the scar on my leg burns with fire, it seems to me that they let me go on purpose. They let me go so that I would know, so that I would remember. so that I would have something to lose when they came for me again. I know that one day I will hear that click again, and then it will all be over. The light of the torches in the cave is so etched in my memory that I see it every time I close my eyes. I have to tell everything that happened on that last night on the island, before I somehow made it to the raft. Because I left out the worst part. What happened between the moment the captain said run and the moment I pushed the raft away from the shore. They grabbed me. I was already knee-deep in water when long fingers closed around my shoulder and pulled me back with such force that I fell. The water, warm, salty, gushed into my mouth and nose, and I choked on a scream that no one heard. Their hands, many hands, cold and bony, grabbed me and dragged me away from the saving sea. I fought. God is my witness, I fought as hard as I could. But there were too many of them, and they were too strong, and my axe had long since been lying somewhere in the sand. The last thing I saw before the darkness of the jungle engulfed me was a raft bobbing on the waves. So close, so unreachable. They carried me through the forest, quickly, confidently, as if they knew every route, every hole in the path. Branches whipped my face, vines clung to my clothes, and the smell, that same smell, rotten and sweet, grew stronger with every step. Then there was light, a reddish, uneven light coming from a crack in the rock, a cave. They dragged me inside, and the first thing I saw was fire, a bonfire in the center of a huge cavity surrounded by stones. And around the bonfire, them, dozens, maybe hundreds. I finally saw them clearly. In the light of the fire, their ugliness was impossible to miss. They were taller than any human being. The smallest of the adults was as tall as a tall man, and the leader towered over him by 2 heads. But it was not the height of health. It was the height of ugliness. Their spines were crooked, their backs hunched, their heads tilted at strange angles, as if their necks couldn't support the weight of their skulls. Their arms hung down to their knees, and there was something wrong with them. Too many joints where there shouldn't be any. Their fingers were long and crooked, with yellow nails curved like claws. Their skin, pale gray, almost transparent, was covered with sores, growths, and bite marks. I saw one of them scratch another's shoulder, leaving bloody streaks on the white skin. They bit each other. They bit everything. Their faces, human features were discernible, but as if reflected in a crooked mirror. Their foreheads were slanted, small, barely covering their brow ridges. Their lower jaws were huge, protruding forward with teeth sticking out in different directions. Some had 2 rows of teeth like a shark. Their noses were sunken, and many had nothing but holes in their skulls. Their eyes were small, deep set in their sockets, but in the light of the fire, they glowed yellow, like a cat's. They were naked, and there was nothing human about their nakedness. Their bodies were twisted, unfit for life, and yet they were alive, moving, looking at me, and among them were females with their young, small creatures clinging to their mothers' necks, with the same yellow eyes, the same twisted bodies. One of them, tiny, no bigger than a cat, looked at me curiously, its mouth slightly open, revealing sharp milk teeth. I was thrown onto the stones by the fire. Nearby was a pit of coals, deep, hot, giving off a heat that burned my skin. Bones lay around the pit, lots of bones. Some were gnawed clean, some were charred, with pieces of blackened flesh. In the niches of the walls were skulls, rows of skulls, arranged with some kind of eerie precision. Hundreds of skulls staring at me with empty eye sockets. And among them were some that were very fresh, with remnants of hair and flesh. They tied me up. Rough ropes, woven from vines and some kind of fibers, were wrapped around my hands and feet, and I felt them cutting into my skin. Then they laid me down by a pit of coals, and one of them, the leader, leaned over me. He was the worst of them all. The tallest, the most disfigured. His spine was twisted so that his head stuck out forward like a vulture's. Around his neck hung a necklace of human fingers, some fresh, with bits of flesh still attached, some dried to the bone. His teeth were filed down and sharpened. I saw this when he opened his mouth and made that guttural sound I had heard so many times before. And he looked at me with something like joy. In his hand was a machete, Cesar's machete. I recognized it by the distinctive scratch on the handle. The leader raised it, ran his finger along the blade, and I saw dark blood appear on his pale skin. He paid no attention to it. He began to cut my clothes. The blade slid across the fabric, cutting through my shirt and pants, exposing my skin to the gaze of hundreds of yellow eyes. A murmur began around me. Quiet, rhythmic, like singing. They were singing. They sang and watched as the leader prepared me for the feast. And then I felt the rope slacken. They didn't tie knots like humans do. The knots were crooked, irregular, tied tightly but without understanding how the rope holds. I had spent my whole life working with ropes. I knew them better than my own hands. I waited. The singing grew louder. The leader put down his machete and turned to the fire, reaching for something in the coals, something that was red hot. They all watched him, every single one of them. I lunged. The rope snapped. Not completely, but enough for me to free my hands. I rolled to the side, jumped up and ran. Screams behind me. The pounding of dozens of feet, hundreds of feet, bare feet on stone. They rushed after me, their howls filling the cave, echoing off the walls. I ran toward the exit, toward the crevice through which they had dragged me. Something grabbed my leg, cold fingers, sharp nails, and I fell. I turned. One of the creatures, young, smaller than the others, had sunk its teeth into my calf. The pain was impossible, white, blinding. I kicked it in the face with my other leg, the one that was free and felt bones crunch. The creature howled and let go, and I lunged forward, leaving a chunk of my flesh behind. I don't remember how I got out of the cave. I don't remember running through the jungle. Only the blood gushing from my leg, their cries behind me, and my own heart beating so hard it felt like it was going to burst. And then the sea, a raft. The tide, and I was free. Sometimes, late at night, when sleep won't come and old nightmares crawl out of the dark corners of my memory, I think about them. I think about who they once were. People. Ordinary people who came to that island hundreds of years ago. Maybe they were the first Spanish colonists. Maybe they were indigenous people, expelled from the larger islands. Maybe they were survivors of some ancient shipwreck. It doesn't matter. Something went wrong. Isolation, hunger, the need to survive at any cost. They started eating each other. First the dead, then probably the weak, then those washed up on their shores by the sea. Generations of inbreeding, marriages between relatives because there were simply no other people, distorted their bodies. Cannibalism, constant, ritualistic, changed their minds. They forgot that they were once human. They became something else, devourers, los comedores, and they thrived. How many are there now, 12 years after my escape? More than there were then, for sure. The island is large enough to feed a tribe, and the seas around it are rough enough to regularly wash new food onto their shores. I think of Captain Salgado, whose smallpox-scarred face was the last thing I saw when he shouted "run" at me. I think of Mary O'Brien, whose scream I heard even through the thunder of my own footsteps. Of Josiah Flint, who cursed us until the very end. Of Caesar, whose silence spoke louder than any words. They are dead, long dead. Their bones lie in that cave, or on the beach among the wreckage of other shipwrecks. Their skulls may adorn the niches in the walls, and I am alive. Sometimes, especially in October when hurricane season arrives and the scar on my leg begins to burn, I'm not sure it's a blessing. There are things I don't tell anyone, things I'm afraid to say out loud because then they'll become too real. In that last second, as I tore myself from the young creature's grasp, leaving a piece of my own leg behind, I looked into its eyes, yellow, deep-set eyes that had nothing human about them. But there was something in them, something that made me freeze for a split second, long enough to nearly die. Recognition. It looked at me as if it were memorizing me, as if it were storing my face somewhere deep in its twisted mind, never to forget. I ran. I escaped. I live in Boston, and I have a wife and a son and a workshop. But sometimes, when the wind comes from the east and brings the smell of salt and rot, I remember that recognition, and it seems to me that they are waiting, patiently, as only they know how to wait, waiting for me to return, or for them to come for me, because they remember my taste.